Michael Carter's sharp instincts as a police chief told him this encounter was taking a dangerous turn. The two officers who stood before him weren't backing down, and their arrogant sneers hinted at trouble brewing. The larger officer took a step closer, his posture aggressive, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Identify yourselves," Carter said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had handled countless tense situations. "Right now." The shorter officer, smirking with unchecked confidence, crossed his arms. "You're in no position to be giving orders, pal. You're lucky we're not hauling you in for impersonating an officer." Carter remained still, his calm demeanor masking the rising tension within. He had dealt with this kind of attitude before, but he wasn't used to seeing it from his own team. "Call it in," he said evenly, nodding toward their radios. "Check with dispatch. You'll find out exactly who I am." The taller officer scoffed, shaking his head. "Do you think we're idiots? We know everyone on the force. You don't belong here." "I'm Michael Carter," he replied, his voice steady, though frustration flickered in his chest. "You're chief of police, and you're about to make a serious mistake if you don't stand down." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. They weren't buying it. The shorter one took a bold step forward, his hand raised slightly in a mocking gesture. "Chief? Yeah, right, next thing you'll say is you're the governor." Carter's patience thinned. "This is your last warning," he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. "Back off or you'll regret it." But they weren't listening. The shorter officer lunged toward him, grabbing Carter's arm in an attempt to assert dominance. Carter twisted his arm free effortlessly, stepping back to create distance. "You're out of line," he said, his voice sharp. "This ends now." The taller officer stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're going to intimidate us?" he spat. "You're just another guy playing dress-up." The words hit Carter harder than they intended, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he kept his stance firm and steady, his hands clearly visible to avoid escalating the situation further. "I'm not playing anything," he said coldly, "and you're about to answer for your actions." Before he could say another word, the shorter officer reached for his baton, his movements quick and aggressive. Carter moved just as fast, his years of training guiding him. He sidestepped the swing and grabbed the officer's wrist, twisting it just enough to make him drop the weapon without causing unnecessary harm. "Stand down," Carter barked, his voice commanding and full of authority. The taller officer didn't wait. He lunged toward Carter, aiming to grab him from behind. Carter's reflexes kicked in, and he ducked under the larger man's reach, spinning around to face both of them. "You're making this worse for yourselves," he said, his voice like steel. "Think carefully about your next move." The sounds of the commotion began to draw attention. A few cars slowed as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening. Several bystanders nearby cautiously approached, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Carter noticed the cameras, but kept his focus on defusing the situation. "You've already gone too far," Carter said, his eyes locked on the two officers. "Drop the hostility, and this ends here. Keep going, and you'll face the consequences." The taller officer hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but the shorter one wasn't done. He lunged again, his fists clenched. Carter blocked the move swiftly, grabbing the man's arm and pushing him back with controlled force. "Enough," he shouted. With the crowd growing, Carter reached for the radio clipped to his belt. He spoke clearly and firmly. "This is Chief Michael Carter. I'm on Route 17 near mile marker 42. I need backup immediately." The mention of his name on the airwaves seemed to change the atmosphere. The taller officer froze, his eyes widening as realization began to sink in. "Wait, Chief Carter?" he stammered, his tone shifting. Carter's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, the same Chief Carter you just assaulted, and you're going to explain this to Internal Affairs." The distant sound of sirens began to fill the air, growing louder with each passing second. The officers exchanged panicked looks, their earlier confidence crumbling as they began to grasp the gravity of their actions. The taller officer opened his mouth as if to speak, but Carter cut him off. "Save it," he said firmly. "You've done enough. You've given up too much too soon." The police vehicles pulled up moments later, their lights flashing red and blue across the scene. Uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern, as they took in the sight of their chief standing resolute before two of their own. "These men assaulted me and obstructed justice," Carter said calmly, pointing toward the two officers. "Take them in." The two men didn't resist as they were handcuffed and placed into the back of the squad car. The weight of their actions finally settled in their slumped shoulders and averted gazes. As the dust began to settle, Carter turned toward the growing crowd of onlookers. He gave a small nod to reassure them before addressing one of the arriving officers. "I'll need a full report on this," he said, "and make sure Internal Affairs is contacted immediately." The officer nodded, clearly rattled by what had transpired. Carter glanced back at the road ahead, the peaceful drive he'd envisioned now a distant memory. His jaw tightened as he processed what had just happened. This wasn't just about him. This was a reminder of the work still left to do, to root out abuse and hold everyone accountable, even those who wore the same badge. Michael Carter stood his ground even as the tension rose to a boiling point. The second officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt, his posture radiating arrogance. "We don't appreciate folks like you trying to act like you're in charge," he spat, his voice dripping with hostility. Carter raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "People like me?" he asked, already knowing where this was heading. The first officer smirked, his expression twisted with malice. "Yeah, people like you," he sneered. Before Carter could respond, the first officer lunged at him, shoving him hard in the chest. The force sent Carter staggering backward, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. As he regained his footing, the second officer joined in, shoving him even harder and sending him sprawling onto the gravel road. Pain flared in Carter's back and ribs as he hit the ground. His mind raced, trying to process the surreal moment. These weren't just rogue aggressors, these were his own officers, men sworn to serve and protect, now brutally attacking their chief without a second thought. But in their eyes, Carter wasn't their boss. He was just another black man they felt entitled to dominate. As Carter struggled to rise, one of the officers delivered a swift kick to his ribs. Pain shot through his side like a bolt of lightning, forcing a gasp from his lips. "You're gonna regret messing with us," the taller officer snarled, his voice low and menacing. Carter clutched his ribs, each breath more agonizing than the last. He raised a trembling hand in an attempt to shield himself. "Stop," he gasped, his voice weak but firm. "I'm your chief, your boss." But his words were ignored. The officers didn't pause. The beating continued, each blow more brutal than the last. As he lay there, battered and bruised, Carter realized this was far from over. They didn't care who he was. They only cared about asserting their twisted sense of power. Gritting his teeth, Carter tried to push himself up again, but his body betrayed him. The taller officer grabbed him by the collar and hauled him to his feet, his movements rough and unforgiving. "Get up," he barked, his face inches from Carter's. His anger was palpable, radiating like heat from a fire. Carter staggered, barely able to stand on shaky legs. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the shorter officer drove a vicious punch into his stomach. The air rushed out of Carter's lungs and he doubled over, gasping for breath. His vision blurred and every fiber of his being screamed in pain. "I told you I'm the chief of police," Carter managed to rasp, his voice barely audible. The first officer let out a cold, mocking laugh that echoed in the stillness of the road. "Chief of police?" he jeered. "Sure you are." The second officer circled Carter like a predator sizing up its prey. His hand hovered near the baton strapped to his belt, his smirk growing more menacing. "You're just another punk pretending to be someone important," he said with disdain. "And now you're gonna pay for messing with us." Carter's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. He needed to think, to act, but the pain clouded his mind. He could feel the weight of their rage bearing down on him, their hatred fueling their every move. "You're making a mistake," Carter said, his voice hoarse, fighting through the pain. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The first officer rolled his eyes, stepping closer until his face was inches from Carter's. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with," he sneered. "Another nobody who thinks they can tell us what to do. You're lucky we haven't thrown you in cuffs yet." The threat hung heavy in the air, and Carter knew it wasn't empty. Their hostility wasn't just for show, they were serious. Before he could reply, the shorter officer grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back with brutal force. The unnatural angle sent a sickening crack through Carter's body, and he cried out in agony. The officer pressed harder, his grip relentless. "Still want to play, Chief?" he sneered, his tone dripping with venom. Carter's teeth clenched as he fought against the pain, his breathing ragged. "I am the chief," he said, his voice strained and filled with determination. But his declaration fell on deaf ears. With one final, brutal twist, Carter felt his arm snap. The searing pain was blinding and his vision blurred as the world around him seemed to fade. He collapsed to the ground, every nerve in his body screaming in agony. The gravel beneath him bit into his skin, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the humiliation and rage boiling within him. Carter knew this wasn't just an attack, it was a message. They wanted to strip him of his authority, to reduce him to nothing. But as darkness threatened to consume him, one thought burned brightly in his mind. This wasn't over. He would make them pay for every single moment of this. Michael Carter's body screamed with pain as he crumpled to the ground, his broken arm limp and useless by his side. Agony pulsed through him with each shallow breath, and the mocking voices of the officers rang in his ears. The first officer loomed over him, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. "Guess you won't be needing that arm anymore," he sneered. "Let that be a lesson about getting in our way." But their cruelty wasn't finished. The second officer turned his attention to Carter's car, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "Nice ride," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "It'd be a real shame if something happened to it." Carter's heart sank. His car wasn't just transportation, it was a symbol of years of dedication, something he'd worked tirelessly to afford. "Don't," he gasped, his voice hoarse and broken, but his plea fell on deaf ears. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a lighter, flicking it open with a wicked grin. "You know," he said, almost conversationally, "we don't usually torch cars. But for you, I'll make an exception." The tiny flame danced mockingly in the wind as the officer approached the car, his steps deliberate. Carter could only watch in helpless horror as the officer crouched by the fuel tank. He turned back, meeting Carter's eyes with a smirk. "This'll teach you to stay out of our business," he said before tossing the lighter. The fire ignited instantly, an angry blaze engulfing the vehicle in seconds. Flames roared as they climbed up the sides, thick black smoke billowing into the air. The heat radiated toward Carter, searing his skin even from where he knelt. He could only stare, paralyzed by pain and disbelief, as his car, his hard-earned achievement, was reduced to a burning shell. When he'd stepped up, "Looks like your wheels are toast," the first officer taunted, his voice filled with cruel mockery. Carter's chest tightened. The car wasn't just a machine. It was a piece of his life, a representation of his accomplishments. And now, in mere moments, it was gone. Destroyed by the very men who were supposed to stand for law and order. But the officers weren't finished. The first one strode back toward him, grabbing him roughly by the shirt and hauling him to his feet. "You thought you could stop us, huh?" he snarled, his face inches from Carter's. "Think again." With a brutal shove, the officer threw Carter back to the ground. His head slammed against the gravel, and the world went dark for a moment. When his vision cleared, he saw the second officer crouched beside him, rifling through his pockets. Carter tried to move, but the pain kept him rooted in place. "Thanks for the cash," the officer said, waving the money in front of Carter's face with a mocking grin. "Consider it a toll for wasting our time." Carter's phone was next, gripped from his pocket and casually tossed into the smoldering wreckage of his car. "Oops," the officer said with mock innocence. "Guess you won't be calling anyone." Laughter echoed in the quiet forest as the officers walked back to their vehicle. "Next time don't try to play the hero," one of them called over his shoulder before slamming the car door. The engine roared to life, and within moments they were gone, leaving Carter alone in the eerie silence. The acrid smell of burning metal and plastic filled the air, and the heat of the flames still lingered on Carter's skin. He lay on the gravel, his body battered and broken, his ribs screamed with every shallow breath, and his arm throbbed with an unbearable pain. But despite it all, a fire burned within him that couldn't be extinguished. A fire fueled by rage, humiliation, and an unyielding determination for justice. Gritting his teeth, Carter forced himself to move. He pressed his good hand against the ground, pushing through the sharp pain in his ribs. Slowly, shakily, he got to his feet. His vision swam, and his legs threatened to give out beneath him, but he refused to stop. He couldn't stop. His broken arm hung uselessly at his side as he stumbled forward. Each step sent waves of pain through his body, but he kept going. The dark, winding road stretched out before him, silent and empty. There were no headlights in the distance, no sign of help. He was utterly alone. Carter's breaths came in shallow gasps as he trudged forward, his boots scraping against the gravel. The forest around him was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the faint breeze. The isolation was suffocating, but he clung to one thought. He had to make it back. He had to survive, not just for himself, but to ensure that those officers paid for what they had done. Pain coursed through him with every step, but his determination overpowered the agony. Michael Carter was many things, battered, broken, humiliated, but he was not defeated. Each grueling step along that desolate road was a promise. Justice would be served. Stripped of everything, his car, his phone, his money, Michael Carter had only his willpower to keep him moving. His body screamed in protest with every agonizing step, his vision swimming in and out of focus as exhaustion and pain gnawed at him. The dirt and blood covering his skin mixed with the sweat soaking through his clothes, and the cool night air stung the open scrapes on his palms. He stumbled often, barely managing to catch himself before falling, but he refused to stop. The mobility testing one by. The faint glow of the town's lights in the distance seemed impossibly far, like a cruel mirage. Carter estimated it would take hours to reach on foot, and every minute stretched endlessly. His mind replayed the events that had led him to this point, disbelief and anger intertwining. How had it come to this? How could two officers sworn to protect and serve have turned on him so viciously? But he knew the answer. To them, he wasn't their superior. He wasn't a man of authority. All they saw was the color of his skin. To those officers, he was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. His position as their boss meant nothing. They hadn't cared about rank or respect, only their ability to dominate and humiliate. The thought made Carter grit his teeth, channeling the fury bubbling within him to push his battered body forward. His whole life had been a struggle against prejudice, but this attack wasn't just systemic, it was personal. Those men had gone out of their way to break him, to leave him discarded on the side of a desolate road, and now they thought they'd won. They thought they could walk away unscathed. But they were wrong. Carter's resolve solidified with every agonizing step. They would pay for this. His knees buckled and he stumbled again, this time hitting the ground hard. Gravel tore at his skin and his broken arm erupted in searing pain that left him gasping. He lay there for a moment, trembling and struggling to catch his breath. His body begged for rest, for relief, but Carter's mind refused to yield. He couldn't let them win. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his knees, then to his feet. His legs shook beneath him, threatening to give out, but he forced them to steady. "I have to keep moving," he murmured, his voice hoarse and barely audible. The night stretched on, the black sky above him offering no comfort. The town's distant lights were his only guide, faintly glowing through the thick veil of trees. Blood dripped down the side of his face, warm and sticky, while every shallow breath sent sharp stabs of pain through his ribs. His broken arm hung uselessly at his side, throbbing with every step, but none of it compared to the fire burning within him, a relentless fury at the injustice he'd endured. The officers had left him there, confident they'd silenced him. They thought they could abandon him to die in the cold dark, but they had underestimated who he was. Carter wasn't just any man. He was their leader, their superior, and he would make sure they regretted their actions. He wanted the legacy of the valor done known for his heroism. Hours passed like lifetimes as Carter trudged along the road, his feet dragged, his steps uneven, each one sending shockwaves of pain through his body. He tried not to think about the burning wreck of his car or the smug, sneering faces of his attackers. He had to focus on the road ahead, on reaching the town and taking control of the situation. The town lights grew closer, but the progress felt agonizingly slow, his pace reduced to a crawl as his body continued to fail him. Each step was a monumental effort, his strength waning with every passing moment. But, finally, the faint outline of buildings began to emerge from the darkness. Relief washed over him, though it was fleeting. His journey wasn't over. Not yet. As Carter crossed into the town's outskirts, the familiar glow of streetlights illuminated the empty streets. Houses and small businesses lined the road, but everything felt surreal, like a distant dream. His mind was clouded with exhaustion, and his body was on the brink of collapse. But he pressed on. He had to reach the police station. That was his only goal. The station wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but it might as well have been miles. Every step was torment, his battered body threatening to give out with every movement. But Carter's focus was unshakable. He needed to see the faces of his officers. He needed them to understand what had happened. And most of all, he needed justice. Finally, the station came into view, its brick facade bathed in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. The sight of it sent a surge of adrenaline through Carter's battered body. He had made it. But as he staggered forward, pain radiating through every inch of him, he knew this was only the beginning. The glow of the streetlights illuminated the brick facade of the station, a symbol of order and authority. Michael Carter's heart pounded as he stumbled toward the entrance, each step a battle against the searing pain that racked his body. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, his vision blurring, but his determination driving him forward. He pushed the door open and staggered into the brightly lit lobby, his legs barely supporting him. Inside, the officers at the front desk froze, their expressions shifting from shock to alarm as they took in the sight before them. Carter's uniform was tattered, stained with dirt and blood, and his arm hung lifelessly at his side. "Chief," one officer exclaimed, rising to his feet, disbelief etched on his face. Carter didn't slow down. Ignoring the stunned silence, he pressed forward, his eyes locked on the hallway that led to his office. "I need every officer available," he commanded, his voice raspy but unwavering. The officers scrambled, their shock giving way to urgency as they moved to follow his orders. Carter didn't stop to explain. He had no time for questions or sympathy. His focus was singular: justice. Every step sent fresh waves of agony through his broken body, but he refused to falter. Reaching his office, Carter collapsed into the chair behind his desk, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. The pain was unbearable, radiating from his ribs and his broken arm, but he forced himself to remain conscious. He couldn't let his injuries defeat him, not now. The door to his office swung open and several senior officers rushed in, their faces marked with worry and disbelief. "Chief, what happened?" one of them asked, his voice thick with panic. Carter drew a slow, steadying breath. His tone was cold, sharp, as he replied, "I was attacked by two of our own." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "They thought they could get away with it," Carter continued, his gaze hard and unforgiving. "I want every unit out there. Find them. Bring them in." The officers hesitated for only a moment before springing into action. The room emptied as they moved to carry out his orders, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts. His head throbbed, his body screamed for rest, but adrenaline coursed through his veins, keeping him upright. Those men had made a fatal mistake, and now justice was closing in. Outside, the station hummed with activity. Officers donned gear, radios crackled with instructions, and vehicles roared to life as teams mobilized. The manhunt had begun. The same force those rogue officers had once been a part of was now hunting them down. Carter leaned back in his chair, wincing as pain flared through his ribs. His mind replayed the attack in vivid detail, the sneering faces, the mockery, the brutal strikes. He clenched his teeth, the memory stoking a fire deep within him. They had underestimated him, believing they could leave him broken and escape without consequence. They would soon learn just how wrong they were. The office door opened quietly and Lieutenant Andrews stepped inside. His expression was grim, his concern evident as his eyes flicked over Carter's battered form. "Chief, we're ready," Andrews said, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "Patrols are covering all major roads and checkpoints. Teams are sweeping the town." Carter nodded slowly, each movement a struggle. "Good," he said, his voice low but firm. "I want them found. Bring them here." Andrews hesitated, his gaze lingering on Carter's broken arm and bruised face. "Sir, you need medical attention," he said cautiously. "Your injuries. Your arm." Carter cut him off with a sharp wave of his good hand. "Later," he growled, his eyes blazing. "Right now, they're my priority." The lieutenant didn't argue further. He nodded and left the office, his steps brisk as he returned to the field. As the door clicked shut, Carter exhaled deeply, his chest tight with both pain and determination. His body begged for relief, but his mind wouldn't allow it, not until those men were brought in. The minutes dragged like hours as Carter waited, his ears attuned to the crackling updates coming through the station's radios. Officers scoured every corner of the town, searching parking lots, deserted roads, and dark alleyways. The tension in the air was palpable, the station buzzing with the urgency of the hunt. But so far there was no sign of the men who had left him for dead. Michael Carter closed his eyes for a moment, taking a shallow breath as he tried to center himself. Pain surged through his body, but he forced it to the back of his mind. He needed to think clearly. Those men weren't going to stick around. They'd be planning their escape. They knew what was coming for them, but there was no way out. He had made sure of that. The sound of the door swinging open pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Johnson stepped inside, his young but serious face grim. His radio buzzed with overlapping chatter. "Chief," Johnson said, stepping forward briskly, "we've got a lead. Someone spotted two men matching their description heading toward the old service road on the edge of town." Carter's pulse quickened. He knew that road. It ran parallel to the highway but was hidden by dense forest, a secluded escape route, perfect for slipping away unnoticed. But it was also the ideal place to cut them off. "Send units there immediately," Carter ordered, rising from his chair despite the sharp pain slicing through his side. Johnson rushed forward, offering support, but Carter waved him off and stood on his own, his resolve unshaken. "I want them boxed in before they get anywhere near the highway." Johnson nodded, raising his radio. "All units, this is Officer Johnson. Suspects have been sighted heading toward the old service road near Route 25. Proceed with caution, they're considered dangerous." Carter grabbed his jacket with his good hand, draping it over his shoulders. His movements were stiff, every motion laced with agony, but his determination was unyielding. "Sir, you really shouldn't go," Johnson said, his tone cautious, though he already knew the response. "I'm going," Carter said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "I won't sit this one out." Johnson hesitated briefly, then nodded. There was no point in arguing. "I'll drive," he said. Carter followed him out of the office and through the station. The room fell silent as they passed, officers turning to watch their battered chief. His torn uniform, bruised face, and the grim determination in his stride sent a ripple of resolve through them. Whatever divisions may have existed before, the department now moved as one, united in the pursuit of justice. Johnson helped Carter into the passenger seat of the patrol car before climbing behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, and they sped toward the outskirts of town, the radio crackling with updates as patrol units closed in on the suspects. Each report heightened the tension in the car. Carter's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his thoughts racing. When they caught those men, and they would catch them, there would be no leniency. As the turnoff to the service road came into view, Johnson slowed the vehicle. The path was narrow, shrouded by trees that seemed to close in around them. Ahead, the flashing lights of patrol cars illuminated the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. "They're here," Johnson said, gesturing toward the cluster of officers spreading out along the edge of the forest. Carter nodded grimly, pushing the car door open and stepping out. His body protested the movement with a fresh wave of pain, but he ignored it. He wasn't stopping now. Lieutenant Andrews approached quickly, his expression taut. "Chief, we've got them pinned about half a mile into the woods. They tried to make a run for it, but they're surrounded." "Good," Carter said, his voice hard. "I'll be there when they're brought in." Andrews hesitated, glancing at Carter's injuries. "Sir, with all due respect, maybe you should—" "I'm going," Carter interrupted sharply. His gaze was unwavering. "I need to see this through." Without another word, he followed Andrews toward the line of officers preparing to enter the woods. The dense forest seemed alive with sound, every crack of a twig and rustle of leaves magnified by the tense silence. Carter's heartbeat thundered in his ears as they pressed forward, the beam of flashlights cutting through the darkness. He wasn't just a man seeking justice, he was a man determined to reclaim his authority, his dignity, and his place as their leader. Tonight, those officers would face the consequences of their actions. Carter would make sure of it. Carter's pulse thundered in his ears as they pushed further into the forest. The flashing lights of the patrol cars faded behind them, replaced by the dim glow of flashlights cutting through the dark canopy. Finally, they reached a small clearing. There, huddled in the shadows, were the two men who had brutalized him. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting nervously between the officers surrounding them. Guns were trained on them, ready for any sudden moves, but the men didn't resist. They knew it was over. Carter stepped forward, his body battered but his will unyielding, his gaze locked on the two officers, the very ones who had left him broken and bleeding on the side of the road. Recognition flashed in their eyes as they looked up at him, realization dawning with a sickening weight. "You thought you'd get away with it," Carter said, his voice low and menacing. "You thought you could leave me out there and no one would ever know. But you were wrong." The two men stared back at him, the arrogance they had flaunted now replaced by sheer terror. Their confidence had crumbled, leaving behind only the stark reality of what they had done. Carter turned to his men. "Take them in," he ordered firmly. Officers stepped forward, handcuffing the two without hesitation. As Carter watched them being restrained, a cold wave of satisfaction swept through him. Justice was beginning to take shape, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Back at the station, Carter sat at his desk, the events of the night weighing heavily on him. His broken arm throbbed, his ribs ached with each breath, and his body screamed for rest. But none of that mattered. His anger burned hotter than any physical pain. Justice had to be delivered, and he wouldn't rest until it was. In the holding cells, the two rogue officers sat in silence. The weight of their actions was finally sinking in. Hours earlier, they had been filled with smug confidence, convinced they could act with impunity. Now, they were stripped of their badges, handcuffed, and awaiting their fate. Neither had spoken a word since their arrest. Whether it was shock, fear, or regret, Carter didn't care. Words couldn't undo what they had done. Rising from his chair, Carter winced as a sharp pain shot through his side. Every step was agony, but his determination carried him forward. He walked through the station, each step deliberate, his presence commanding. Officers paused as he passed, nodding respectfully. Their faces reflected a mixture of admiration and concern. They had seen him return, bloodied, bruised, and broken, yet determined to see justice served. Now they watched him walk with purpose, knowing this was no longer just about the law, this was personal. Reaching the holding cells, Carter stopped and locked eyes with the two men. Gone was the arrogance that had fueled their actions. Now they sat small and defeated, their fear palpable. They wouldn't even meet his gaze, their bravado replaced with the reality of their downfall. Carter stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, unable to hold Carter's piercing stare. Finally, his trembling voice broke the silence. "Chief, we didn't know, we didn't—" "Ah! Didn't know?" Carter interrupted, his tone sharp and seething with fury. "You didn't know when you dragged me out of my car, when you broke my arm, when you set my car on fire?" The taller officer's head dropped, his words failing him. His partner sat frozen, his wide eyes fixed on the floor, silent and unmoving. Carter stepped even closer to the bars, his voice low and cold. "You didn't care who I was," he said, his tone steady and cutting like a blade. "You saw a black man and thought you could do whatever you wanted. Beat me, humiliate me, leave me to die, and you thought no one would find out." The silence in the holding area was deafening. The officers sat motionless, stripped of their power and left to face the truth. Carter stood tall despite his pain, his presence casting a shadow over them. This wasn't just about his authority. It was about making sure they never did this to anyone else again. The taller officer gripped the edge of the bench, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. His voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "Chief, we made a mistake." Carter's piercing gaze bore into him, cold and unyielding. "A mistake?" he repeated, his tone sharp with disdain. He shook his head slowly, his voice steady but cutting. "A mistake is something you can fix. What you did was no mistake. It was deliberate. You knew exactly what you were doing." The room felt heavy. The silence, suffocating. The two men shifted uncomfortably, the gravity of their actions pressing down on them like a weight they couldn't escape. Their once confident facades had crumbled, leaving behind nothing but fear and regret. Carter took a step back, his expression hard and unreadable. "You will pay for what you've done," he said, his voice like steel. "You'll never wear a badge again. I'll make sure you can't even sweep the floors of this town. You're finished." The taller officer's face twisted in desperation, his bravado completely shattered. "Please, Chief, Carter raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I don't want to hear it." His voice was resolute, leaving no room for argument. He turned to the other officers standing nearby, nodding toward the cell. "Take them to the briefing room. I want the entire department to see what happens when someone betrays the badge." The officers moved swiftly, unlocking the cell and pulling the two disgraced men to their feet. They didn't resist. Fear radiated off them as they were led out of the holding area and down the hall. Carter followed behind, each step deliberate, his presence casting a long, intimidating shadow. In the briefing room, the tension was palpable. Every member of the department had gathered, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. When Carter entered, followed by the two officers, all eyes turned toward him. He walked to the front, standing tall despite the pain radiating through his body. The two disgraced men were forced to stand beside him, their heads hung low, their shame evident. "This department stands for justice," Carter began, his voice steady and commanding. "We are here to serve and protect, not to abuse our power." These two men violated that trust. They attacked me, their own chief, because they thought they could get away with it. They thought no one would hold them accountable. The room was silent, every officer hanging on his words. Carter turned to the two men, his gaze icy. "You are no longer police officers," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You will never wear a badge again, and I will personally ensure that no department in this country ever hires you." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then his tone shifted, sharper and colder. "But that's not all. You will buy me a car exactly like the one you destroyed, and you'll pay for it out of your own pockets." The taller officer's face paled further. "We can't afford." "You'll find a way," Carter interrupted, his tone merciless. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your lives paying for it in other ways." The room remained silent as Carter stepped closer to the two men. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "This is your chance to make things right. But don't mistake this for mercy. You'll live the rest of your lives knowing you crossed the wrong man." With deliberate slowness, Carter raised his good hand and delivered a sharp slap across the taller officer's face. The sound echoed through the room, the humiliation stinging far more than the physical blow. The officer flinched, his face burning with shame. Carter turned to the second man and delivered the same blow, leaving both of them standing in abject disgrace. "Get out of my sight," Carter said coldly. "You're done." The two officers were led out of the room, their heads hung low in defeat. The room remained silent as Carter turned back to his department. He didn't need to say more. The message was clear. Betrayal would not be tolerated. Justice had been served, and the consequences were swift. Outside the police station, Carter stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. The night air was cool against his bruised skin, a stark contrast to the fire still smoldering in his chest. He had done what needed to be done. The two officers who had brutalized him were now stripped of their power, humiliated in front of the very department they had served under. But Carter knew the wounds ran deeper than the physical pain or the immediate betrayal. He had spent years building this department, working tirelessly to gain the respect of his team, to prove he could lead with integrity and fairness. In one night, two of his own had nearly destroyed that trust. As he stared into the quiet night, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps behind him. Michael Carter didn't turn when he heard the footsteps approach. He already knew who it was. It didn't take long for him to see that it was the woman he'd seen standing nearby earlier. "Chief," came Lieutenant Andrews's steady voice, quiet but firm. "The paperwork is done. They've been officially removed from the force. They won't be coming back." Carter gave a small nod, but he didn't respond right away. The weight of the night pressed heavily on him, the exhaustion seeping into every bone. Yet, beneath the fatigue, a simmering anger still burned. The punishment the two officers had received felt hollow. It didn't erase the humiliation, the betrayal, or the pain. "I know you did what you had to do," Andrews continued, stepping closer. "But you're injured, sir. You should be at the hospital. You need rest." Carter finally turned to face him. His expression stoic, unreadable. His voice was hoarse, worn thin by the night's events but still carrying an undeniable authority. "There will be time for that later," he said quietly. "Right now, I need to make sure this department understands that what happened tonight will never be tolerated. Ever." Andrews sighed, his concern evident. "They know, Chief. Everyone saw what happened in that briefing room. They won't forget it." Carter looked down at his hands, the knuckles raw and bruised from striking the disgraced officers. He thought back to their faces, twisted with humiliation, stripped of the power they had abused. It had been a small victory, but it did little to fill the void inside him. The betrayal ran far too deep. "Those two," Carter said, his voice tight with restrained emotion, "they weren't just bad officers. They were a symptom of something much bigger, something I've been fighting my whole career." Andrews stood silently, giving Carter the space to continue. "I've spent years trying to build trust," Carter said, his gaze distant, his words heavy with unspoken truths. "Trying to prove that I deserve to be here, but for some people it doesn't matter what I do or what I stand for. To them, I'll always be—" He trailed off, but the weight of his unfinished sentence hung in the air. Andrews shifted uncomfortably but spoke with sincerity. "Sir, we all respect you, this department respects you. What those two did, it doesn't represent the rest of us." Carter's sharp gaze locked onto him. "Maybe not," he said, his tone edged with bitterness. "But they thought they could get away with it. That's the problem." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with frustration and unspoken truths. Carter knew the issue went beyond two rogue officers. It was a systemic problem, deeply rooted in the very foundations of law enforcement. A misuse of authority that needed to be uprooted, one step at a time. He couldn't fix it overnight, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try. "This department needs to be better," Carter said, more to himself than to Andrews. "I need to be better." Andrews frowned, his worry deepening. "Sir, you've already done more for this department than anyone else could. You've led with integrity and strength. What happened tonight wasn't your fault." Carter shook his head, the bitterness in his voice unmistakable. "Maybe not, but it's my responsibility to make sure it never happens again." Turning away from Andrews, Carter stared out at the empty streets of the town he had sworn to protect. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on him, the responsibility of preventing future injustices feeling like an impossible task. But he couldn't turn away. Not now. The actions of those officers had left a scar, one that would take time to heal, but Carter was determined to lead the fight. "Starting tomorrow," Carter said, his voice resolute, "every officer in this department will go through new training. Cultural sensitivity, use of force, everything. And anyone who doesn't take it seriously, they're out. No exceptions." Andrews nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised by Carter's decision. "I'll start organizing the details in the morning." Carter gave a curt nod but wasn't done. "And those two officers," he added, his voice cold, "they'll pay for my car, every last cent." Andrews raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Understood. I'll make sure it happens." "After that," Carter continued, his tone hardening further, "they're done. They'll never work in law enforcement again. I'll see to it personally." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the night hanging heavily between them. Carter's mind raced with plans for reform, for rebuilding trust, and for ensuring that such betrayal never happened again. This was just the beginning. Finally, Andrews spoke again, his voice softer. "Chief, you've been through hell tonight. You need to rest." Carter sighed, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. He had pushed himself far beyond his limits, and his body was screaming for relief, but his mind wouldn't let him stop. "Not yet. I'll rest when this is done," he said, though he knew deep down the battle ahead would be long and unrelenting. Andrews gave him a small, understanding nod. "Take care of yourself, Chief. We need you," Vicky said. With that, Andrews turned and walked away, leaving Carter alone in the quiet night. Carter stood outside the station for a long time, his thoughts swirling. Justice had been served, but the deeper issues still remained. The fight against systemic racism and abuse of power wouldn't be won in a single night. But Carter was resolved to lead that fight, no matter how long it took. As he finally turned to head back inside, His body aching with every step, Carter knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. If this story moved you, hit that like button, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. Your support means everything. Let us know where you're watching from.